Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, you could. I mean, I said how I thought La Dolce Vita is probably the greatest film because it's great in the most ways of any film that I've ever seen. But 2001, is as close to a perfect and great film as you can get. It's greatly acted, greatly written. It is tender. It is deep. These people who think it's boring, you're a fucking idiot. You're a fucking idiot. Jessica and I laughed at this one guy who did this YouTube video. Landscape.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, when you see the jungle animals, or then you see them going to, and you go, it takes 4 minutes and 38 seconds for them to get from one moon base to the other base. But look at what you're getting there, the scenery. Look at what it's setting up there. Or the scene where the pen is floating about or whatnot, which was used simply by gluing a pen onto a see-through piece of glass and just turning it ingeniously in front of the camera.
The people like that are, in a way, I mean, you can destroy them in argument, but they're unhelpable.
Yeah. Um,
I also want you to mention, since we're on a track on films, who out of the newest discoveries of foreign filmmakers has impressed you the most, or is it? Can you boil it down to one?
Out of all foreign filmmakers,
Out of all foreign filmmakers that you've seen.
oh, I mean, certainly, I think Kurosawa was the most diverse that I've seen. He, Koba, it gets back to the idea I've often said about, I have a certain few saws that I hang out. I talk about my three intellects theory, which when I get to creativity, I'll talk about that. Functionary, creationary, visionary. And most of these great filmmakers would be at least in the creationary, but most of the best ones are certainly visionary to a certain extent. And then I talk about quality, quantity, and diversity. And diversity probably encompasses Kurosawa the most. Because when you think about it, Bergman basically had uh, either a few lighthearted comedies early on, and then he had his period where he was doing these sort of dour, uh, very experimental films in the '60s throughout the most of the '70s. But Kurosawa, a lot of people say, well, he all he did was the historical films and the modern films, but the if you look at something like Kurosawa from his main period of 1950 to 65, if you look at, I think I've seen all of his films in that 15-year golden period of Kurosawa, with the exception of The Lower Depths. So he did, I think, 13 or 14 films there. I've seen all but one. Rashomon is set, in ancient times. It's got the great four different viewpoints. It has the terrible ending, which I'm doing a Kurosawa show this Sunday. I'm going to have to mention that. It has that terrible ending, but other than that, he didn't make that mistake again. Most of the rest of his endings are great. Then he has Akiru, which you have the main story, and then the second half of the film, or the last 40%, is the people talking about the main character, which is very daring. Then he does Seven Samurai, which is his most complex. There's the most character development in that film. It's a great film. But it's also an action film that developed a lot of action tropes that are used around the world. Then he does something like The Hidden Fortress, which is a comic film, which is always talked about as a template for Star Wars. But it's obviously much better film than Star Wars. But it's a really good film. Then he does Throne of Blood, which is probably his weakest film of those in that period that I saw, but it still got some memorable moments. Then he did The Lower Depths, which I didn't see. Then he does a modern film again with The Bad Sleepwalker, which has one of the most chilling endings of all time. This old man who's a lackey of the vice president of a company who's just killed off the main character played by Mifune. Imagine a Hollywood film where in the end you kill off Tom Cruise or George Clooney or Brad Pitt, and and you don't suffer any consequences as the bad guy. Well, that's what this film does, and it's a brilliant takedown of corporations and corporate evil. Then he goes on. He does Yojimbo and Sanjuro, which are lesser films. They're comic films, but they are so well made that you can overlook some of the lightness and the frothiness of it. Then he comes back. He does High and Low, which is, I think, his probably his best film that I've seen. It's very Shakespearean. Again, broken into two distinct halves: the initial crime, and then the aftermath, where we follow this criminal that we don't ever really find out about. Other and he's someone who just randomly picked this crime to do, and there's no lesson to be learned, and it ends with the great confrontation between Mafuni and the criminal, and then the blinds come down, and the guy is just a lunatic. And then the last one there is Redbeard, which is a great overlooked film that again does a lot of interesting things with human psyche. And then he had two really excellent films towards the end of his career: Kagamushi in 1980, which is a historical film, and it's better than Ron, which usually is thought of as better. Ron is almost like a fairy tale kind of film, but the plenum of these great films that he did, and even some of the earlier films that I saw, a couple of his films like Stray Dog before Rashomon, he was always trying to do something different, and uh, that's something that I'd have to say probably, even though Kurosawa isn't my favorite filmmaker, he's not even my favorite Japanese filmmaker, it would be hard to argue against him as probably the greatest filmmaker that I've seen. Antonioni, in his greatest films, is certainly there. I just rewatched Il Grido, the film he did before he went into his famous modernist period. It was his sort of last neo-realist film, and that's a very good film, neo-great film, I'd say. So there's a lot of things there. Kubrick, he has six, seven films that can be put against anyone. Wells did more with less than anyone that I know of. Cassavetes' top three films are as great as anything, and I think The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, you could make an argument that that could be the greatest American film. It's certainly the greatest American film that's about real life and real people that I've ever seen. Woody Allen, Crimes and Misdemeanors, Stardust Memories, Another Woman, his three greatest films. He's got maybe five, six, seven other great films as well. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, these are all filmmakers that are well within the canon of great filmmaking. Even Charlie Chaplin and some
What
of his
about Werner Herzog?
yeah, his early stuff there. And speaking of Ingmar Bergman, though, Herzog is a guy who has no fucking clue about films outside of his own stuff, and even his own films, he doesn't seem to recognize it. And you don't know whether that's part of his shtick or whether he really means it.